Well, my clock says 11:03. Thanks everybody for joining us today. My name's Anna Kowalczyk. I'm the museum administrator here at the Livingston County Historical Society and Museum. This is our fifth and final lecture on the 1918 influenza. Just to let folks know, I will be taking the recordings of these 4 out of the 5 sessions. The first one, unfortunately, did not record properly, so we will post the PowerPoint at least. And then lectures 2 through 5, the audio and the Zoom call will be posted on our website. Give us a little bit of time to do that. It will happen. I promise you, just give us a little time and we'll make sure that it happens. It'll be on our website for everybody viewing pleasure. Immediately following this lecture, if you stay on your email, you will receive a survey. I posted it for noon today. So if you're in the able to give us some feedback about this lecture series, we have about 10 questions. It'll take you maybe a couple of minutes, that's it. And we really value your feedback. A lot of you have been with us all 5 sessions, some of you only 1, but all of your feedback is valued to us. And then before we start, I see everybody's muted themselves. Thank you. We'll have a chance to unmute if we've got some questions halfway through and then again at the end. But before we went on, I wanted to let you know we followed up on one of the questions that was posed last year or last Saturday about the normal school. And if you got the Zoom link, if you scroll down towards the bottom, there was some information about that. If you didn't scroll all the way down, you can do so after the lecture. But Liz Argentieri helped us kind of sleuth out some information. And basically the short version is the normal school in Geneseo never did close. They had a meeting about it, chose not to, but in a few of the Lamron, their school newspaper, you can see references to the flu, people who were absent, students who didn't come back, some of the changes that were made, but the school never did close. And that's the answer to that. So without further ado, David Pompliss, he's earned his Bachelor of Science in American History and Political Science from Empire State College. He earned a Master of Arts in American History from SUNY College at Brockport, where he wrote his master's thesis on the 1918 influenza in Livingston County. He earned a Master's of Arts in Social and Public Policy from Empire State College and is a doctoral student in education at Valdosta State University. So David, thank you for your time and effort, and we look forward to today's lecture.
Thank you, Anna. Good morning, everybody. I hope everybody's doing well. It's nice to see, like Anna had mentioned earlier, it's over these 5 weeks, I'm starting to get to really recognize names and faces. So hopefully once the museum is ready to open, and I know Anna and Sue have been working really hard on the 1918 influenza epidemic. Hopefully we'll see some of you down there to see the exhibit. Anna and Sue have really been putting a lot of work and effort into that. So I'm looking forward to seeing that. Today, what I was thinking, usually the slide presentations go about 17 slides. I intentionally made this one shorter. So I kind of synthesized and summarized a lot of the information that we're going to talk about. So then that way, hopefully at the end, I know there's some questions in the chat already, and some of you have photos of family members who were involved or around during the 1918 influenza epidemic and have some stories to share. So I think that would be a really good thing to go ahead and open that up. With that in mind, I kept the presentation a little shorter. So if, when we get to the discussion part, if it doesn't go the full hour, that's okay. I would rather give you guys all the information you need as opposed to just talking to fill time. So that's all right. Today we're going to look at the two things, the aftermath and the continuing relevance. And what's interesting is when I first started researching this, the continuing relevance was the connection to the H1N1 flu, and there was a PowerPoint presentation that went up around the college that was put together. And a large portion of the end piece of that PowerPoint was sort of cryptic, like there's probably going to be another pandemic. This was done back in 2013. There's probably going to be another pandemic. We don't know when. Are we prepared? How are we going to respond? And some quotes and documents of scientists talking about the possibility of another epidemic. And now I feel like that ending portion, that continuing relevance, is very, very different than when I had originally put it together back in 2013. So for the continuing relevance piece, it's kind of interesting because we're already sort of living in it right now, I think. So hang on one second, and what I'll do is I will go ahead and share my screen, and we can get started. And again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. And the presentation, it's kind of, I think you'll find it interesting to see how people remembered and thought about the epidemic after it was done, because Americans' attention spans start to turn and focus to other things. But that initial period after the epidemic is just loaded with paranoia. The reports in the newspapers reporting about the epidemic end fairly abruptly also. Um, Historians and scientists sort of view the final wave as going until June of 1919, but by the time you hit April, people are spent. Um, and the newspapers reflect that. They're not reporting so much about the influenza as much as they're talking about, is this thing going to return? There's a lot of paranoia going on about the flu epidemic returning. And so that's what we're going to talk a lot about today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we can get started. Okay. So this is the final lecture. And before we begin, I just want to thank the Livingston County Museum for hosting this and having me. I've really enjoyed coming on these last 5 weeks and really kind of getting to talk to and get to know everybody who's been participating. So I really appreciate that. I've really enjoyed it. It's been a great opportunity. So in April 1919, the epidemic isn't over, but it is kind of it's starting to wind down. We're not seeing the numbers that we did, especially during the second wave. The third wave overall was not as awful as that second wave. So the third wave, it's already, the wave itself, it's starting to wind down. But by the time you get to spring, that April, May of 1919, things are really starting to wind down. The influenza is burning itself out, and it does not do very well once the weather starts to heat up. So newspapers abruptly stop reporting on deaths and epidemic once April hits. It was actually sort of odd to see, because from spring of 1918, you see this gradual ramping up of discourse and dialogue about this epidemic. In the summer, and maybe it dissipates, but it's still there. In the fall, that deadly second wave, it's everywhere. Into January, February, March, really, it's everywhere. It's on in every page of the newspaper, our stories about it. And then by April, it stops. And I don't mean like a gradual winding down. At least around Monroe County, New York, Livingston County, New York, it completely stops. People are done talking about it. But warnings are now starting to dominate the newspapers. Warnings. People are worried that, okay, well, in 1918, by the time we hit spring and summer, it died down. And then it ramped up with a vengeance in the fall. So people are really worried that either this same influenza strain will come back, or there will be more. There will be another epidemic. Newspapers continue to warn that the medical community has not identified the cause of the virus, which is something that's playing into ramping up this sort of paranoia. Remember, at this time, Americans are not only coming off of the epidemic, they're coming off of World War I. And there were a lot of deaths just from World War I. Combine that with the influenza epidemic, this virus that the medical community is still not quite sure about. And that's also feeding into this worry that the epidemic either isn't really over. It's going to come back in the fall, just like it did a year ago. And last week we saw some of those cryptic images that people were relating the influenza to. You had the Spanish lady, the Grim Reaper, and so forth. So it was really embedded in the psyche of not just the American people, but people all over the globe. So the newspapers are warning they haven't identified the cause of the virus, so they really don't know a lot about it. And actually, as far as the medical advances, there are a lot of medical advances that come out of the 1918 influenza epidemic, but we don't start to really know until about the 1930s. We start to really make advancements and start to understand what happened. So at this point, nobody knows what's coming next. So this is kind of an interesting quote. It's out of Brockport, actually, but I thought it was pretty interesting and relevant. Until proof to the contrary is forthcoming, it must be assumed that the epidemic represented, hang on one moment, a very virulent form of the same disease which has spread throughout the world from time to time for many centuries. So citizens, like we talked about in week one, flu epidemics are not abnormal. They've always happened and they'll continue to happen. It's just the size and scope of this one was so terrible. And going in with the paranoia, once this flu epidemic starts to wind down, citizens are unable to differentiate between the normal cold and influenza. In other words, really, I think what that's getting at is after the epidemic, somebody starts feeling sick, they automatically think they have influenza. They're panicked, they're paranoid, they're worried. They're lumping kind of all these symptoms together. So there's a real fear going on. The American population is very paranoid, and I think justifiably so, about this epidemic or something similar coming back, especially because in that summer of 1918, it really did die down. Sort of, and I think we saw that with COVID in the summer. It was there. We knew it was there, but the numbers sort of died down a bit, and it's really ramped back up. One major issue that had to be dealt with after the 1918 pandemic were the amount of orphans. The pandemic really decimated families. This is kind of, if you ever get the chance, this is sort of at the very bottom here, this is sort of an interesting article, a Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918, a defining characteristic in the life and history of the American family. And it really was, because it either kind of destroyed families, removing both parents or one parent, and for a generation after that especially, there's a constant private mourning and remembrance about what happened. So following the epidemic, many people start to turn to the aftercare of orphans. There are millions of orphans or half orphans, children who have lost one parent instead of both. New York City alone has 31,000 orphans. That's just New York City alone. So this is sort of interesting because citizens really do start to come together to take care of orphans. They start to create makeshift orphanages. Now, care of the orphans primarily went to surviving family, but that didn't always happen. And in the case where it doesn't happen, citizens start to step up to take care of these children. One example is John C. McGinnis, who opened her home to, quote, babies that were not wanted after they were orphaned out of the epidemic. She raised enough money to support local children with the, of course, with some help there with the aid of the Worcester Women's Club. So community members start to come together to care for orphans, and this is really a big issue because there are millions of orphans after the pandemic. So if that's something you're interested in, on sort of the effects of the pandemic on the American family, the way it affected the family dynamic and the family makeup, and how families looked at each other post pandemic, this article by Ellie Vance is pretty interesting. It's some good reading material for you if that's something you're interested in. One big fear, and this you see a lot throughout the newspaper reportings, is that the medical worries of secondary illnesses. So it's the medical community, they start to worry that, okay, survivors of the epidemic, what's going to happen to them as a result of maybe having it, right? Those sort of secondary illnesses. So health officials start to turn their attention now to potential after effects of the virus. Um, and, in, and they state that though the quarantines have been removed, survivors are at risk now of other ailments. The big worry was tuberculosis and other ailments of the nervous system. The medical community was really worried about a potential connection between that strain of influenza and tuberculosis. And just to throw this out there for the sake of, um, I guess, transparency or giving both sides of this story. And it's not something I'm going to talk a lot about because it's something I don't know a whole lot about. But there's been, as far as recent scholarship, we talk about right now pre-existing conditions with COVID-19. Um, there's some recent scholarship about tuberculosis in the time of the 1918 pandemic, and some of the scholarship, it looks like, is starting to lean toward tuberculosis as a pre-existing condition to a lot of the high rates of death in the 1918 influenza epidemic, and that the pandemic sort of thinned the population of tuberculosis, leading to its eventual diminishment. I don't know a lot about it. That looks like that's more recent scholarship. But at the time, anyway, doctors are really worried about tuberculosis and secondary ailments, particularly ailments of the nervous system. They warn that following a virulent epidemic, diseases of the nervous system typically follow. So one doctor here, Dr. Copeland, hang on one moment, announced that all persons who have the disease, and particularly pneumonia, should have themselves carefully examined within 2 months, and to make sure that they don't have anything else. So they need to have themselves carefully examined immediately and at regular intervals for 2 months. And this is out of the New York Times about aftercare. So there's a shift to worrying about and handling this death and this disease, and now, and this sort of public mourning that we saw in the second wave. And by the time the third wave ends, the public mourning is sort of gone. It's private, it's turning to private remembrance and fear of what's coming next. Driving this fear of tuberculosis in the epidemic is the fact that England and Spain really start to report a spike in tuberculosis following the epidemic. They start focusing on tuberculosis. That really starts to feed the fear. And connecting this, remember, the earliest reports of the 1918, of that influenza epidemic, came out of Spain. And now Spain is reporting this huge spike in tuberculosis. So that's starting to really drive fear and paranoia. And so this results in the U.S. Public Health Service warning the epidemic of influenza in Spain has already caused an increase in the prevalence and deaths from pulmonary tuberculosis. This is already in December here, December 1918. And this continues. You'll see these sorts of newspaper articles throughout the pandemic, but they really ramp up. There's always going to be some overlap. But at the end of the pandemic, it really ramps up. This is really what people are talking about now. Are the potential after effects, the aftercare of orphans, after effects of the pandemic, and now these sort of high numbers of tuberculosis that are being seen globally. And public health officials are now warning that lingering colds could be early stages of tuberculosis. So this fear that's going on, Americans and again and populations throughout the globe are having trouble now. If they get a cold, is it influenza? Is it the early stages of tuberculosis? There's sort of a panic going on, a real worry. Farmers. This affects farmers and Livingston County, being very rural. This really was reported quite a bit in local Livingston County newspapers. This comes out of Mount Morris, the Picket Line Post. Farmers start to fear flu spreading among animals, particularly poultry. In Mount Morris, newspapers warn of avian illnesses that resemble the more malignant forms of influenza in the human family and among animals. The article actually it suggests quarantining chickens and hens, or if need be, just killing entire flocks if you have to prevent the spread. Because there's also an economic connection here. Farmers fear the economic impacts, especially hens laying eggs, and chicken and other forms of livestock. So there's an economic component here. It's not only fear of illnesses spreading maybe from animals to people, but killing entire flocks of chickens and hens and other and livestock. So what's important to remember when we say that the pandemic ends, it doesn't really. I mean, it does. The pandemic, in terms of what we would look at as far as numbers and massive amounts of infection and death, that ends. But it keeps coming back. It's not as though we hit June of 1919 and all of a sudden it vanishes without a trace. It's gone. It keeps coming back, and it's still with us today. We talked about back in week one the 2009 H1N1 and the connection between the H1N1 and the 1918 strand of influenza. This picture here, if you think back, for those of you who were with us last week, we talked about that family in Dansville and Mount Morris. There was Martha and her son Walter. They both passed away. They died of influenza. Catherine, she and her son George came down with influenza, and her husband Frank said that he was going to have to leave when they pass away because there was nothing left for any of them. They also had a baby named Walter, who they named him after the well, it would be his uncle who died, Uncle Walter, who died in the epidemic. And then in 1927, the baby passes away. The baby gets pneumonia from influenza, secondary effect of influenza, and died of pneumonia. And this is just a copy of the baby book that Catherine wrote down regarding this child catching the influenza and dying of secondary pneumonia, just like his uncle before him and grandmother and so many other people. So when it's important to just note that when we say that the epidemic ended, it didn't. There are still sporadic reports of outbreaks throughout the globe. It's just not on such a massive scale. So I think with that, if we want to stop for a moment, if there are any questions, comments, anything that's come up. Like I said at the beginning, this one's a little bit shorter than the other ones, just because I want to open it up for discussion at the end. But does anybody have any questions?
I'm going to ask Marshall to unmute himself and ask his question about public health.
Yeah, David, you mentioned the U.S. Public Health Service, and of course there wasn't a CDC then,
Right.
but are you aware of what happened to the funding and growth and development of public health efforts after the pandemic? Of course, they weighed in on questions like this, but was their funding increased? Did it become much more of an awareness of the American public?
Well, it's sort of interesting because, well, to answer your question, yes, it did. You start to see a lot more funding for these public health organizations. There's a lot more research. After this, we're going to start talking about some of the medical advancements that came out of the 1918 influenza epidemic because of the need and the demand for more medical research, more medical technology. So yeah, but something happens in the 1920s, the Roaring 20s, and we're going to talk about it because people forget about the epidemic a little bit for a little while. But once the 1930s hit, there's a lot of advancements, and one of the things that happens that really sparks investment in the scientific and medical community is there are bodies found, and I think we talked about this a few weeks ago, I think it was Antarctica, and they dig up the bodies and they were frozen, perfectly preserved, and it turns out they turned out to be victims of the 1918 flu epidemic, perfectly preserved. So they were able. So it's in the 30s, especially with those types of discoveries, that we really start to learn a lot more. And there's much more of an awareness of public health and public safety, even though people are not publicly talking about it. They're really privately remembering the 1918 epidemic and recognizing the need for more technology. And there's just as society grows, there's just going to be natural technological advancements too.
Thanks.
Sure.
Go ahead, Mr. Pomplus, not David, but the relative asking your question about orphans.
Sure. David, when you were talking about orphans, I was thinking in a more cultural, historical perspective, and that is 30,000 orphans in New York alone from this time, babies, young children. And I was thinking, and this could be way off the mark, the importance of a cartoon like Little Orphan Annie. Is that a way during that time that people were somehow digesting the fact that there are these orphans there, or is that just sort of out of the ballpark?
No, I don't think it's necessarily out of the ballpark. I mean, that's not that more sort of cultural or even pop culture at the time. That's not really something I looked into a whole lot. But if you think back to last week, I don't think you're out of the ballpark because that's how people deal with horrible loss. We talked about last week that the sort of imagery connecting death with and the personification of death and the illness. People work through their emotions through things like art, and nowadays books, movies, music, same thing. I actually have I'm going to pose that question to a friend of mine. I have he went to Brockport. He just finished his PhD, and that is actually his area. He looks at pop culture and how it connects with historical events and how it's used. So that's a really good question. I'm going to pose that to my friend and see if he can get a more definitive answer.
I also have a comment on personal grief as opposed to public grief. Mm-hmm. And it deals with this picture, because that is a picture of my uncle who died in Dansville. And I remember coming home from college, and my mother was looking at the baby book and she was crying. And I said, "Mother, I know this is your brother, but he died before you were even conceived." And she's still carrying the grief that she picked up probably from her own mother. Mm-hmm. It's
Yeah.
amazing how this energy just gets passed along to, where now her grandson is talking about the darn flu epidemic.
Well, I remember, what's going on? Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I remember getting sick as a kid, and I think I told the story in the first week, and looking at my grandmother and saying, "Don't worry, it's probably just the flu," and just like the look of dread on her face. Let's see. Are there any other questions here, or can we
Yeah.
move
Peggy
on? Or are there
Gosling,
some
why
other
don't you go
questions?
ahead and unmute yourself, and then we'll take Linda's question too, and then we'll move on.
Okay. Are you aware of other more general economic effects of the first pandemic,
Yes,
such
and
as
we're
there are
gonna
today?
yes, and that's going to be the next section here.
Okay.
We're gonna talk about that a little bit. Yeah.
Okay. And the other question that I would have, and maybe you're going to cover this as well. I know in the UK, 'cause we've had a lot of illness and death for quite a long time here, and they're beginning to find the incidence of something that they call long COVID, which is a variety of nervous system diseases, general lethargy, loss of speech and language, loss of mobility, and so on. Is that something that's being recognized in the States as well?
Um, y- yes, to a degree, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but as right now, the focus, I think, as far as public discourse, and anybody I think can chime in here um, about this, but I think it's really this push to get everybody vaccinated. Um,
Yes.
once that happens, then we can start worrying about, I think, the after effects of it. But there's really a push right now just about the about getting the vaccines. But yeah, I mean, people are talking about the potential long-term effects of it. Sure.
I mean, this is coming up, particularly the people who have been hospitalized and have been on ventilators, and some really serious long-term effects are being observed.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of talk about the long-term effects, especially on the lungs um, of people getting it as well. So
Mm.
yeah, yeah.
Linda, why
Any
don't you
other
ask your
questions?
question and then we'll move on. I have a comment later, but go ahead, Linda.
Okay, I'm still a little hung up on the testing. Like, what do you know? Like, was it in the 30s when the microbiology advances allowed testing on those bodies from Antarctica? Or at what point did they really truly identify this as an influenza virus? Or did that term, I don't know, like now up till then they were going on symptoms and the, was it really the same virus? At what point did they really develop the testing to
Yep.
know?
Yep. You start to really see it in the 30s and after. The 30s is where it really starts. Now, understanding of the virus, it's still going on. I mean, we're still learning new things. We just recently they did a whole genome sequencing on it, and we were able to learn a lot more. And now there's some who are theorizing that this thing was actually seeded in 1916. That it didn't really start in 1918. They think it possibly
Yeah.
was starting to seed in 1916, and then it blew up in 1918.
So how do they
Not
know that? Are they like able to isolate the virus from a dead body from
mhm.
from 1918 or
Yep,
wow
yep,
or 1916 or
yep.
yeah,
They have remains from
that's cool.
1916, 1918. A lot of them,
Yeah.
especially those bodies that were frozen. There's a really neat documentary series about the expedition to excavate the 1918 influenza bodies and what they did, and just how much we learned from it because of how perfectly preserved they were. I can't recall what the name is off the top of my head, but I can. And PBS did one as well on that similar subject.
Okay. Thanks.
Sure. And Anna, did you want me to go ahead and move on? Okay, we don't have a whole lot left. Just a few things to talk about. So this is from my first week, from that first presentation. This is the same slide, but let me go backwards here. But it's relevant because the strain, it doesn't really go away, right? We talked about this in week 1, how similar it was to the strain of 2009. Originally, the flu in 1918 was thought to have jumped from pigs to humans, but now we know it was an avian origin. And then the virus then jumped from human to swine, resulting in that swine flu epidemic. So it's just another, and there were other epidemics. There was a flu epidemic, I believe it was in 1967 or 68, that went through, nowhere near as bad, I don't think, as the 1918 flu epidemic, but they still happen. And in 2009 there was the swine flu epidemic, and it's very closely related to the 1918 strand. So for as much as we can say that the epidemic ended, it did, but it's still with us. Okay, one thing that explodes in the newspapers: fear of influenza. Once you start overcoming this public discussion or fear about it, fear shifts from influenza to Russians. You see it in all the, starting in the summer of 1919. It's just all over the place. Everybody's terrified of the Russians now. That's the new worry here, the new fear. Because in 1917 there's a revolution. There's the Russian Revolution. They abolished the monarchy, and in 1923, with the Bolshevik establishment of the Soviet Union, Americans are afraid of communism. They're afraid of the Russians, and I think that dominates a lot of sort of American fear or paranoia from that point up until 1991. But this is kind of where it starts. And again, in the newspapers, there is a major shift from a fear of influenza to a fear of Russians and communists. So these are just some newspaper clippings. It's from around 1920, and as you can see, people are really ramping up their fear here of the Soviets, of the Russians, following the revolution. So that's kind of interesting. It's just sort of going from World War I to the epidemic, fear about the epidemic, and now fear of Russians. So epidemiologists, and of course, obviously historians, but epidemiologists are really starting to look to the past to try to make general predictions about where we're going. Historian Alfred Crosby basically said political scientists will make fairly direct predictions, whereas historians will make generalized predictions, right? The outcome of this epidemic, it's not going to be identical to 1918, but there are some things we can look at to see kind of where we're going. And I really wanted to end this series on a positive note, because I think we have things to be optimistic about. I think we have things to look forward to. And we have things that are in our favor that civilization had before us, or society had before us. So Dr. Nicholas Christakis, he's a Yale professor and epidemiologist. He basically believes, number one, we can expect economic recovery. We're going to be okay. He thinks we're going to begin heavily spending. Once this is done, he thinks you're going to see a lot of heavy spending, Americans seeking out social interaction, really craving it. He does warn, expect promiscuity. We saw that after the 1918 epidemic in the Roaring 20s. So, people are isolated. When they can, they're going to really seek that social interaction, which is really the opposite of how we react during a pandemic, right? During the pandemic, when there's the heavy death and suffering. There's an increased religiosity, social distancing, and very frugal spending. People are saving, they're isolating. After the pandemic, the trend tends to be it's not just a gradual move. It's kind of an explosion. People really want to get out there and be with each other, and really start spending too. So, looking at what comes next, well, there are somebody asked the connection between the 1920s and now. And so what comes next? Well, our economy isn't doing so well. We all know that. But in 1920 to 21, there was also an economic depression following the pandemic and during the pandemic that really hurt the U.S. economy. It wasn't a Great Depression, but it was a bad enough depression. And people were economically suffering. But there's recovery. And once recovery happens, Americans started to seek out social interactions, and they really start spending. And we have the Roaring '20s. One, of course, caveat to that is the market crashes in '29 and leads to the Great Depression. But there is a connection there between the way people were behaving throughout the '20s with the spending and the social interactions, especially of the '20s, and that fear and isolation of World War I and the epidemic. So we do have there have been quite a bit of medical advances as a result of the 1918 influenza epidemic. Number one, vaccines for seasonal influenza. Development of pandemic vaccines. We have drugs now to treat seasonal influenza. Creation of ventilators and ICUs, intensive care units. Tests developed to detect various forms of influenza. You can now just go get tested and they'll tell you if you have influenza A or whatever it is you have. And we also have a global influenza surveillance system. And I just think this was a really optimistic quote about what we're dealing with now. We're the first generation of humans alive who has ever faced this threat that allows them to respond in real time with efficacious medicines. It's miraculous. So these last couple slides, I just thought it was kind of neat to compare pictures of today to pictures from 1918 because they're really similar. There's not much different there. And with that, I'll stop sharing. And that's, so we still have about 15 minutes. So that really concludes the lecture piece of this. But I know in the chat, there were some people who wanted to share stories and pictures. Anna, I'm gonna sort of, I think, pass this off to you to take a look.
Sure. We still had a little questions before we do that. I know that Martha Simpowski, she has some pictures to share. I wanted to ask Kathy Deffenbach to unmute herself first about the orphan trains question.
I just wanted to know if orphan trains started in this period, you know, like the Anne of Green Gables or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that I really am, that I'm not sure. I don't know the answer to that question. I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Sue.
I looked it up while you were talking because I thought that too. It started in 1912 and it didn't seem to have an impact. It didn't seem to continue because of, which I thought was odd. I would have thought if you had all these orphans and you already had a system in place, but it was 1912, but I'm not sure when it ended, if that was a continuation or not, but.
Thanks. Hal Bauer, you kind of had a question about anti-mask movement, and I think there was a piece a couple sessions ago, but I think it's worth repeating. And then go ahead and unmute yourself and talk about also what you're seeing as a physician.
Well, I'm not a physician.
Oh.
I was just curious, since it seems to, for some people, it's a political statement to wear a mask or not wear a mask in rural New York or Pennsylvania. So I was curious if there was a political tie to kind of denying the pandemic of 1918 and 19, like there seems to be now.
Yeah. I think it was 2 lectures ago. We talked a lot about that. If that was something that you missed, I think Anna's going to put them all up, like she said, on the website. So you can take a look at that. But yeah, there were anti-mask movements, and there was a sort of a rivalry between people who wore masks and people who didn't. The people who didn't wear masks, were referred to as mask slackers, not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And it got violent. There are reports of people being shot because they weren't wearing their masks. In California, they would take people who weren't wearing their masks and basically forcibly take them to a Red Cross and make them wear a mask. It got violent, got really violent. But yes, to answer your question, there was definitely they had anti-mask gatherings, anti-mask meetings. They would make fun of people who wore masks and put them on their dogs as a mockery. So yeah, definitely.
And before Martha, you're going to be next to share your screen. I just want to make a comment about somebody who had asked sort of about the chronic, the long haulers, what we're seeing, what we don't know. We don't know what we don't know yet, I believe, right? And the personal story of the 20-year-old friend who had COVID, but then recovered, but now has, heart conditions and can't get up the stairs and fatigue and brain fog, and goes to the cardiologist, and this doctor says, yeah, I've seen this in COVID patients. I just don't know what to tell you. I just don't know what to do for you right now. So I think just like 1918, as David mentioned, there were some neurological effects. There were things that happened, and I'm not as knowledgeable about it, but I remember reading about sort of these things that happened to post 1918 influenza patients. So I think that's something that we're still going to learn, and maybe that's part of our exhibit, continues to grow and recognize the things that we don't know. But great. So Martha has something to share, and we're going to let Martha Simpowski unmute herself and share a screen. And then when you're through, I'll ask you to unshare your screen, and we'll let Trish Jones follow.
Okay, well, just get these pictures out of the way. Let's see. Well, my sister, Peggy Gosling, who some of you have heard from asking her questions, and I would like to share information about both our paternal and maternal grandparents. On the paternal side, both lived in Utica and both died of the influenza in 1918, leaving our father and his sister orphans. They were adopted by family members, though, coming back to what David was talking about earlier. But I also, after listening to what David said today, I will point out that my grandfather, Maurice Brayton Gosling here, did have tuberculosis. Everyone thought he had recovered, and he had been up in Saranac and had come back to Utica at Christmas time the year before, and then the next year in October back to Utica again, and he died. And the second group of people, is our maternal grandparents, Peggy's and mine. All were sick in bed with influenza. My mother told me this. She was actually 5. In this picture, she's only 3 here. But they were very sick. She said no one was getting out of bed. They were cared for by her grandmother and her aunt, who came into the house regularly and cared for them, and they all lived. In turn, the 2 children that are shown here both lived to nearly 100 years of age. So in terms of after effects, I know nothing. I never heard anything about after effects from that. So anyway, this has been a personal thing for us in watching this series, because we had the experience of both parents having told us about their parents and their experiences during that period. So thank you, David. We've enjoyed it. Peggy, did you want to add anything?
No, I think you've covered it, Mark. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for the opportunity. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for sharing that. Trish Jones, I believe you had something to share, and I remember from last week, I think your story too, the nice thing that came out of the 1918 influenza. So go ahead and unmute yourself, Trish Jones.
I'm looking for it here.
Okay, take your time.
I think you need to stop sharing, Mark.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm trying to get to it here.
It should be hopefully at the bottom of your screen. Is there a stop share? There you go.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, I mentioned on the first time that my father's mother died in November of 1918, on November 25th, which was her birthday. The little guy in the front was my father, who was 6 at the time, and this picture was just taken shortly before she got the flu. His father, they lived in St. Paul, and his father completely withdrew into himself emotionally, and he moved the family, the 3 children, back to Washington, D.C., where he had 3 maiden sisters, and they lived with them, and they did all of the childcare till the kids grew up. So it kind of affected their lives. And the oldest girl, my Aunt Mildred, the only thing I remember about her was that she was a total germaphobe her whole life, and it had to have been connected to this. So this was my father. And that's all I have to say. So did I unshare?
Not yet.
Oh, stop share. There it is.
There you go.
I'll get this stuff figured out.
Thank you. Is there anybody else who had something they wanted to share out? Scrolling through.
I see I'm still unmuted. I just
Okay.
want one further question, if no one else is going to take the time. It's the word grip, which I've seen you've mentioned a couple of times. I saw it in something you wrote there. And it's interesting that in my childhood, my mother used that word all the time, grip. If we needed an excuse for not going to school, it was always the grip. She had the grip. I wonder if other people had that experience as well, and whether it's just a time, defined thing. We don't hear about the grip anymore, But is that what the did that start with the 1918 flu?
Yeah, that was commonly used. They referred to it as grip and the Spanish influenza, but usually it was grip.
The grip.
Yeah, and I just think that's a generational thing.
I think it is. My mother spelled it in those notes to school, GRIPPE.
PPE, yep. If you look at anything from that era there, whether it's newspapers or even diaries or letters written, they refer to it as grip, spelled GRIPPE.
Mm-hmm.
My uncle, who was a child and survived the flu, George Brookins Hinman, he would always talk about the grip. And I always thought at first that it was like, because he used to like to get your legs, do things, I learned later that it was the flu. But when I was a kid, and maybe this is generationally too, and people can think about or respond to this. As a kid, we used to say, oh, I have the 1-day flu, or, oh, I have the 3-day flu, a completely different understanding of how we view the flu today. And one other comment, it has to do with your statement about the Russians, the fear of the Russians. But I'm thinking about that time, and is it totally the fear of the Russians, or is it the fear of immigrants? Because we suddenly didn't build a wall. We just changed the law to pretty much stop immigration from around the world into the country for 2 decades.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the newspaper articles, it's fear of Russians. It's been, they're very blatant about it. It's right out there in the open. It's
And fear
communism
of,
and Russians.
yeah, and fear of Chinese, and fear of Spanish, and fear of Italians, and everyone else that was no longer allowed in.
Yeah, but the newspapers, they're very focused on Russia because of the Bolshevik Revolution.
David, I know that John Barry is somebody who's a known author on the 1918 influenza, and people could Google him. I know he's done a couple interviews sort of about the parallels between the 1918 influenza and COVID. So that's something if people want to look for a little bit more. Are there any other, in case people, I know they're just waiting to come into the exhibit at the museum at some point, but are there any other sources that you might want to recommend to people if they want to learn more moving forward post this lecture?
Yeah. So once the PowerPoints are posted to the website, all my sources are listed on there as well. And I like anything done by Alfred Crosby. He's done a lot of great work on the 1918 influenza epidemic. There's some really good works on, it depends on what you're looking for. If you're looking at it, if you're looking for works on the American perspective, of course, then you're going to want, you know, for the most part, anything done by Alfred Crosby will help. There's a great book that I've been going through right now. I can go grab it, and it's, again, the title is listed in my PowerPoint, but it's a collection of primary source material. So it's a collection of letters, and the author provides commentary on those. It's called Pandemic 1918. That's really good.
And I think a great final question, Michael Zaller, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, Dave. So being a history major, how are you documenting this for possible people to use in the future as reference material? You know, what are you doing to kind of record this?
When you say, are you talking about the COVID epidemic?
Yeah, the COVID epidemic.
Yeah. So the biggest thing for me, I think, has been collecting. My daughter has been keeping, she kept a diary, writing, and it kind of, my oldest, she'll be 14 in May. She's kept a diary that goes kind of back to day one and tracks everything she's been thinking. So because I think her generation, you know, every generation is sort of defined by something. You know, my parents' generation is Vietnam, or my grandparents maybe World War II. Ours, Mike, I think, was 9/11. I think these kids, it's COVID. So I think that's really the perspective I'm really most interested in, is seeing what they say.
And it's important to note that we've asked our constituents that if there are artifacts or memos that are documenting, or photographs documenting this time now, that's what museums are here for. That's what the historian's office is for. So the Livingston County historian, if you just look at her website, she's collecting stories, videos of how, you know, how has COVID-19 impacted your life. So people are taking those stories now. We'll take a copy of David's master's thesis, put it in our archives, and we will document this. Give me a couple weeks, but we will put these videos on our website, and I'll put it on the main screen to tell you where to go and find that, so that you can access it. So I've been really delighted about our participation. Thank you for all of those who were interacting. And I remind everyone that if you open your email now, you'll have a survey that you can complete, and it should be super brief. And if you do that, it helps us know if what went well, what we can improve, what you might like to see in the future moving forward. So thank you, everyone. Especially thank you to David for working so hard on getting this material to all of us.